We're live.
Paul.
Good morning, Paul.
The contractor was a no-show.
We have COVID in the family, so we had to cancel all our work today.
Oh dear,
Oh.
sorry about that, but nice that you can join us. Okay, so I would like to call this planning committee to order on May 27th at 10:03. And the first order of business is that we adopt the agenda as circulated. So can I have a mover for that? A seconder? So we'll have Jack move and Beth second, and all in favor. And that is carried. So the second item of business is to approve the minutes, and they were all circulated. I noticed that some of the comments that Armin had shared in our previous meeting were also sent out this morning. But have everyone had a chance to look through the minutes, and are there any comments, errors, or omissions? There being none, can I have someone move that we accept the adopt the minutes as circulated? Peter, and seconded by Armin. And all in favor? Thank you. Okay, so as I think you all saw with the agenda that came out, the primary focus today is more of an informal discussion, and we've had an opportunity, hopefully all of us, to review some of the material that Beth has sent out. And I thought that it might be useful, we'll just kind of put Beth on the spot a little bit here, but in your work, it appears that you have some interesting checklists that are being used by various municipalities so that there is an ability to ensure that the appropriate documentation is there, the appropriate reports and studies. And I see that there's differences in kind of the bolded groupings of them, but the contents tend to have a lot of similarities. Did you want to walk us through a little bit of the focal point there, and how we move from items that are in a list to things that are required, and then the timing of those submissions?
Well, Mr. Chair, yeah, hopefully as everybody's taken a look at it. I just provided samples of 2 of the projects that I'm currently working on that have recently been declared complete. And I did caution in my note, obviously, that they're urban circumstances, so there'll be a whole number of reports that would never be applicable to the township of Georgian Bay. But what that does is provides a general checklist as you're going through the pre-consultation process with the applicant as to which ones would apply and which reports would be needed as part of a complete application. And as I said, it was a one-size-fits-all, but there's probably a number of reports that are needed for our township and things to be considered in our township when applications come forward that never would be applicable to an urban setting. And one would be waterfront access, for instance. But the key reports that I saw, which I sort of focused on in my note to the members of the committee, was a planning justification report. That's a standard practice in all urban municipalities. And that's where the applicant, and I didn't go into this at all, but that's where the applicant sets out what is being applied for. And it's more about the need versus the want, i.e. why can't you build within the prescribed zoning bylaw setbacks or the policies in the official plan. So that's really what that pertains to. A functional servicing report, very essential in an urban setting, as it should be in a similar fashion, but obviously looking at different things in the township of Georgian Bay. For instance, in any of my urban related projects, the functional servicing report has to be done as part of a complete application. you have to demonstrate that there's capacity in sanitary sewer, or that there's water main capacity to service, or there's existing capacity in the stormwater management pond. And while that doesn't apply here, I think the concept of the functional servicing aspect is critically important because, I do periodically monitor a number of applications that come forward, whether it's be lifting of a hold or rezoning, or whether it's a total rebuild of an existing developed lot where they're going from a 1,200 square foot cottage to a 3,500 square foot building and 2 bunkies, is that we haven't always been consistent in looking at and confirming the ability to service before the planning approvals are put in place. And I think that's a very critical piece of the puzzle, because how do you approve a full build out at 3,500 square feet and 2 bunkies on an island property if you don't have the servicing capacity with an existing septic, or you don't have the ability to expand that septic, for instance? There's a whole bunch of things I could go into. I don't know what you want me to elaborate on, Mr. Chair, because there are some notes obviously I've provided, and feel free if there's anything in particular you want me to expand upon. I really would love sort of comments of the other members of the committee in terms of what they feel is critical as well.
So I think what might be useful is just to kind of engage in an open forum on these kinds of topics. For example, you've indicated that there are a variety of things in some of these more urban settings where things have to be done in advance, and I think it's probably a fair observation in the township that there are assumptions that the planning department takes things down to a certain stage and then lobs it over the wall to the building department, and then hopes that the building department looks after a lot of the septic and servicing, as what you call functional servicing, as part of the pure building process. But if I hear you correctly, what I think I'm hearing is these are items that in other environments are handled from a planning perspective, and you're looking at the big picture where you're considering those elements along with other elements such as environmental studies and so on, because what you're trying to do, as I understand it, is get a complete picture before you lob it over the wall to site plan or building. Is that?
Yes, absolutely, because you can't require those studies as part of a site plan process. The Planning Act limits what you can cover under a site plan agreement, for instance, and I hope that'll be a discussion on another day, another agenda item. But rightly so, once the zoning is in place to permit that full build out or to establish a building envelope, for instance, and you've established a principle of development to the applicant. And what happens if, when you go to apply and oops, well, we don't have a place for a septic anymore. We've put the cottage where the septic was ideally to be located, or we don't have the ability to expand it properly. And I kind of mentioned some of my past experience, and when the Ministry of the Environment was handling septic approvals in this township, before that was delegated to us, you had to demonstrate that there were 2 locations for a septic on a property, because if one failed, you had to have a backup location. And so there was a very environment first focused, and which there used to be in our township under a long ago era under an older planning director, that it was always environment first. You cited the septic because that's the most critical. The septic's on the Precambrian shield. There's very little natural overburden. It's in fill over bedrock, which not so coincidentally all drains to the lake eventually. But the most important thing is to establish the ability to service before you can grant an approval. It's just too late down the road. And that's what happens in the urban environment. You have to verify that you have the capacity in the system, you have the ability to service it. And those conditions get set as conditions of approval of a rezoning or a plan of subdivision that you have to then implement through a subdivision agreement. We seem to be doing things a little backwards at times here in our township, which has surprised me and others, that really, the water quality is so critical. We need to make sure that that is protected for a number of reasons. We drink it, we swim in it, and it's really where our value is as a recreational community.
So perhaps, I guess one of the key triggers in this conversation has come from Bill 109, which is driving some new requirements. I'm not suggesting I understand what all those are, but it would appear that, and we've thrown this label out here, complete application. It would appear that the importance of a complete application with all of these appropriate studies and things that you're referring to here become more and more critical under the guise of what's coming down or what has come down with Bill 109, so that as a township begin to consider an application, we have an ability to say the application is complete. Now the clock starts ticking, and now we can deal with the time window that we are required to work with. But presumably, and from what I'm kind of reading in your material, the scope of a complete application is likely going to be much broader than what we have previously been looking at. Is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, well, maybe we could just back up and hopefully everybody understands what Bill 109 is. We know it was brought in place very quickly. We know it's really to provide more homes for more affordable homes for more people. It doesn't even apply to our township, but because of the broad brush approach, we have to somehow manage that. And one of the ways of managing it is with respect to complete application, because the implication to the municipality is with the prescribed timelines for applications that are set out in the Planning Act, it's 90 days turnaround for a decision on a rezoning, 120 for an OPA and rezoning, and 60 days on a site plan application. And I know it's often been used as a way to push out the notice for a public meeting and to get a report to council as soon as possible, but often that's been done when the application isn't complete. So one way is to manage this, because we've been dealt with this hand and we need to figure out the best way to manage it, is to set the criteria properly for what is a complete application, whether it's the checklist or a guidelines or a protocol. I don't know what exists or if it exists today in the township at all. It probably does, but I don't know that. And then once you've gone through the pre-consultation and an applicant has provided all of the necessary studies that are deemed to be applicable to that particular situation, and they're all in, then an application is deemed complete. The municipalities typically, and I don't know whether this is the practice in our township, but would typically issue a notice saying your application is now complete. And that's what starts the clock ticking. And why that's important with Bill 109 is because, for instance, on a rezoning, it's 90-day turnaround. If by the 91st day, there hasn't been a council decision, the municipality has to refund the applicant 50% of the fees. If it takes double the time, it's a total refund of the fees. So basically, it would be putting in our municipal staff in a position of reviewing and dealing with applications at no cost to an applicant. And so that's huge financial implications to municipalities. So I think this is a critical for the township, because it's all, if it's not covered by the applicant, it's going to be covered by the taxpayers, because staff has to be funded some way. That this is just a potential way of establishing a complete list, making sure everything is in before an application is deemed complete. And I think, and I put this in my note, I believe a site visit is very important. Our entire township, coastal aspects of our township versus the hamlet in Honey Harbor, Port Severn, is totally unique and different, and very difficult to assess if there's a suitable location for a septic system when A, you can't get to the site in the winter, and B, it's snow covered. And believe it or not, there have been past experiences where applications have moved forward in the dead of winter. An engineer has said, oh yes, we can fit a septic system because it meets this setback, but they've never been on site to determine if there's any overburden or the direction of drainage. Anyway, those are the sorts of concerns I've seen which is why I believe there's a better way to manage it going forward with a complete application, and a site visit. Not in all cases, but most cases should be something that is part of an application to be deemed complete.
Armin,
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for your submission, Beth. I've got a few comments that I believe are relevant, and I started my business in 1975, and since that time, septic site suitability has been a big part of every new lot creation that I've been involved with, and I think others as well. That's back in the days when you used to drive up to Bracebridge and the District of Muskoka were in charge of land division. That was a key component. You had to produce, have somebody that was in the know about septics, either an engineer or an experienced contractor had to say, yes, this is where the plan is, and provide a draft plan of where the septic could go, meeting all of the relevant setbacks and so forth, and even determining what kind of site soils are there so that you can determine the T time on which the design of the septic is based. So I don't know where this came from, that that if it's happened, it never happened on any of our applications, and I don't know how planning would review or invest any significant amount of time in review of an application without having that septic information present. Even in more modern times, I mean, the idea of the second location for the septic system, it was deemed to be kind of redundant, because it was, obviously in our area, probably 95% of all septic systems that are installed or designed for properties, especially on offshore locations, are built up beds. They're imported sand. All of the engineering is done ahead of time, and then the location is approved by the municipality, by the building department, and or by an engineer, and then the work goes forward. So it doesn't make sense to require two septic locations when all you can. I mean, if you need to replace one, the worst case scenario is you dig out what's there and you put back in exactly the same location under better standards than what it was installed in the first place. So I do believe that there is a remedy for that, and that the second one is not necessary. And it would be particularly difficult to establish two septic locations given the current 100-foot setback everywhere in our township. That's been mandated, since 2014. So that's it would make it almost impossible for people to build on a property, or even to rebuild an existing cottage on many of these smaller lots. Back about I can't remember the exact timing of it, but it would have been probably 7 years ago. We actually did our own little study on Honey Harbor jurisdiction. What sort of properties are there, and it was determined that 70% of the waterfront properties with boat access in particular were an acre or less in size. So when you consider that you have a 100-foot setback from the waterfront, you've got to be able to put that septic in the back half of the property, so to speak. And that becomes particularly challenging, as we've discussed many times on these properties. When you look at them, they're not dead level. The properties often rise steeply in grade the further back you go from shore. If you look at Go Home Lake, maybe Jack can back me up on that. I mean, many of these properties, if you go back 100 feet from shore, you're either in the middle of a cliff or on top of one. And it's very challenging to be able to get access to some of these properties where you can't even get in with equipment to put a septic. So, there may only be one location for the septic, and that's definitely got to be preserved at all costs. And if somebody builds on the only septic location that's feasible on that property, then they'll either have to move the building or tear it down if they want to do other renovations. So, and one of your recent comments, Beth, was that Bill 109 doesn't apply to this township, and I vehemently disagree with that, because this township of Georgian Bay is not only high-end shoreline properties that are owned by the rich and famous. There are people here that make up a lot of the workforce, and they can't afford that type of property. They have places that they need that are away from the shore, and more modest properties, if you will. And even those more modest properties now are starting to sell in the $800,000 range for a 1 acre lot on the Honey Harbor Road. If it's got any kind of a reasonable building on it. So I think we need it more than ever in places like ours where, and this isn't unique, our area is not unique in that there are many rural communities, and over COVID times, since the pandemic started sort of 2.5 years ago, people are seeking refuge out in the wide open spaces. And it's driving the prices up to the point where people who are servicing this community can't live here because it's too damn expensive to buy a property. So I would submit that that's exactly the wrong comment. I think Bill 109 applies exactly to places like ours. That's all I got for now.
Thank you.
So,
Paul.
Mr. Chair,
Paul, go ahead and I'll come back to you. Was
Okay.
it Peter that wanted to talk as well?
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to, sorry,
Go ahead.
want me to go ahead?
Paul, go ahead.
Okay, let's go back to the most restrictive type of issue is that we have a number of undersized islands out in Georgian Bay, and the previous planning regulations put a holding pattern on that lot in order to determine that they require a survey to determine the minimal size of the lot. And right now, all we require is a survey to lift the holding restrictions. And there's been some debate about, is that enough? And I tend to agree that maybe we should have a little bit more. Like, for example, if the lot did meet minimum standards, is there a building envelope? Is there a septic envelope? Can you actually get to the island all year around? Sorry, with all the various water levels, and is there a place for a dock? I think all these issues should be addressed prior to lifting the hold on the property. Once that all those issues are resolved, and I think at that point, I think you do need a site visit from our staff to verify the septic location, the building envelope, and even navigable waters to get to the property. So I think that all should be reviewed before we lift the hold. And then once we do that, then you can have some serious consultation with staff to find out what other studies you need to do, environment studies and so on afterwards. But I think there's some minimums that would need to be required in lifting these holes and so on. And I think a site visit is definitely required before we get into a lot of these expensive studies.
Thank you, Paul. Who else was wanting to pipe in there? It was Peter. Go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks to Beth for circulating the information that she sent around and the documentation. I found that very helpful in trying to get my mind around this whole issue. And I've been giving it some thought. And I think we need to think about this in the context of policy issues versus administrative procedural issues. Because I think the policy framework is already there or largely there. If you look in our OP, in particular paragraph I.6.2.1, there is a list of, I think, 35 different studies or pieces of information that the township can request as part of an application. And that to me, in effect, is our checklist, if you like. Whether the township is using that checklist administratively in the course of considering an application or not is another question. But I think the policy framework is there. It includes the things that Beth has talked about, such as planning justification report, environmental reports, It includes what it describes as master servicing study / servicing operations report, which maybe the wording is a little awkward, but I think we conceivably under that you could include some demonstration that there's a suitable site for a septic system. So I think policy-wise, the framework is there. Administratively, the question is what constitutes a complete application. So I think administratively, the township is in a position, township staff are in a position when they receive an application to go through that checklist and say, here are a list of reports that we need from you, applicant, as part of a complete application. And if that isn't the practice now, I think it becomes far more important that become part of the practice, especially in light of the financial penalties that are being introduced in Bill 109. So I think it's good that we're having this discussion in this committee, but maybe it's not the right place for this discussion to take place, or not the only place where this discussion needs to take place. And unfortunately, due to circumstances, we don't have the director of planning as part of this discussion today, but that's something that the planning staff really needs to, I think, address. The one thing that is a little bit odd in this context is the whole issue of a site visit, because the Planning Act and the regulations under the Planning Act speak to what the township can require from the applicant as part of a complete application. And as I say, we've got our checklist of 35 or so items in the OP, but I'm not sure administratively how you make a site visit part of a complete application, because that's something over which the applicant doesn't have control. You can't require the applicant to have the township conduct a site visit before the application is deemed complete. So that's something administratively, again, that I think the township needs to think about in terms of how that gets addressed. But those are my general comments, and I hope it's useful to sort of think about this whole issue in that context.
So just before we recognize Armin, I just want to ask you a question, Peter. You've highlighted the fact that the policy tends to be there, and I would agree. I've read the OP several times, and there's all kinds of great language in it. You indicated that there may be some administrative needs to or administrative policies or practices to change, and I would be interested in hearing, in the context of this need for a complete application from to start the timer, so to speak. What guidance do you think we should be providing council on what you're labeling the administrative processes, which are really it would appear that the administrative department, planning department, have discretion on whether they ask for things or not, and if they choose not to ask for something and it's needed at some point in time and the clock is ticking, then we've run out of time. Could you just kind of offer comment on that kind of conundrum there?
Sure. I think, as Beth has pointed out, it's important that the question of what reports the township should request, it's important from an administrative point of view that be addressed at the time the application is first considered, not at the time of site plan review or building permit application. And it becomes all the more important now because of Bill 109 and the financial penalties that are going to follow from that. So I think what council needs to be aware of is the need and perhaps the urgent need to ensure that issue is addressed administratively within the township, so that the timing of the request for those reports is addressed upfront. A secondary issue, which kind of crosses over both policy and administrative, I suppose, is, do you want to, as a matter of practice, does the township want to say that of the 35 items in the OP, here are 1 or 3 or 5 specific items that should be requested as a matter of course in, say, for example, an application for severance where you're creating a new lot, or some other type of planning application. And as you say, right now it's left to the discretion of planning staff, and maybe that's sufficient, but council may want to consider whether, as a matter of policy, certain reports should be required in certain specific types of applications as a matter of course.
Thank you for that. I do have some other questions. I'll come back to that later, though. Armin, you wanted to weigh in on this?
It's just building on what Peter just said. There is in fact a process in place whereby the municipality's building department requests a septic site suitability inspection that's carried on by township staff. If you have a septic replacement or an enlargement for whatever reason, and somebody makes an application and they don't have a modern survey, but they have a large enough property that there's no question that the setbacks can be met, then they'll do what's called a septic site suitability before they will even consider any application. So there is a process in place right now by the building department that does that, and it's at the cost of the applicant. I believe it's kind of lost track of it now, but I think it's around $200 that is charged, and usually the contractor will supply access, transportation and so on for that purpose, so that they can be present to hear the comments and that kind of thing. So anyway, there is a process in place for that, Peter.
Thank you. And Peter, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but I would like to ask you a couple more questions, just to kind of pursue this a little bit further. Speaking from history here at the township, we know that there's rich language from a policy standpoint in the OP. There is also a reflection occasionally of those policies in zoning bylaws, and it would appear that the planning staff are quite diligent in following the zoning bylaws when they reflect that language that has come from the OP. But it doesn't appear that that same rigor takes place where things are not reflected in the OP. And so I'm curious as to what kind of guidance you would offer to the township where I guess the term would be planning have absolute discretion on what reports they ask for and don't ask for. And yet I think what I'm hearing and seeing with Beth's material here is that there should be more rigors in what must be asked for at the early stages in this process, so that we get to this complete application. And I'll just stop and ask, can you comment on those things?
Sure, and this is connected, but let me start by just briefly replying to Armin's comment, and I hear you, Armin, in terms of the the process for septic suitability when there's an application for a building permit. But I think Beth's point is that in some cases, maybe in all cases, depending on the type of application, that the suitability for septic is an issue that needs to be addressed when a planning application is brought. So if it's an application for severance, that issue needs to be addressed before the lot is created, because by that time it's too late, and all the building department can do at that point is make some determination about where the septic should go, and without sort of having gone through the process before the lot is created of determining whether there's even a suitable site at all on the property for a septic. And more generally, I think the as I say, the framework, the policy framework is there that gives township staff the authority to request any one of these 35 items as part of a complete application. The policy issue, and administratively now, I think township staff, whether at the direction of council or otherwise, need to make sure that they have the checklist in place or whatever, and that they address their minds to the complete application requirements at the time the application is received, because if they don't, the township is facing huge financial penalties for not doing that because of Bill 109. I think policy-wise, as I said, there may be, council may want to address their minds to whether for certain types of applications, certain reports or submissions should be required as a matter of course, not as a matter of discretion. And if council wants to pursue that, there may be a need to introduce some amendments to the OP that rather than say these items may be requested by the township, the OP may need to be in mandatory language saying these items shall be requested or must be submitted as part of a complete application in these types of applications. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And Peter, I do like simple solutions. And I'm wondering if there is a path here that could be navigated. So your comment is the OP has these definitions of where reports are needed, et cetera. And presumably a fair amount of thought has gone into the OP to create these requirements. And they have conditions so that it's not kind of a blanket requirement. You always need this, you always need that. For example, if I'm within, I don't know, I'm guessing here, but let's say I'm within 20 meters of an F1 fish habitat. I need to do a fish habitat impact assessment before I can even do any reconstruction. And I think the wording in the OP is somewhat optional, as opposed to, as I think you said, shall. And I'm wondering if your guidance here is, if we just went to the OP and changed the words from may be required to, given this condition that it just talked about, shall be required, that essentially accomplishes, I think, the same kind of thing that the zoning bylaw does, which is if it's in the zoning bylaw, it shall be required. But if it's in the OP, it seems optional so many times. Am I getting it right, or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer that question. It may be more a question for a planner, but my understanding is that if the OP says it's required, then it's required and staff need to follow that. If the OP says it's optional, then it's within the discretion of staff whether they request it or not. And I think there are some examples in the OP where it is required, and I think the fish habitat assessment may be one of them, for
Yes.
example.
Beth, you wanted to?
I was just going to, yes, Mr. Chair, I was just going to say, in terms of planning language, if you were to put the word shall in the official plan, then that would mean every study listed in the OP would be required for every application. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think what you need to leave the wording as is in the official plan, but have proper guidance and protocol internally to Peter's point, the administrative aspect of saying, in what situations do you need these reports? For instance, if somebody has applied for an addition to an already developed property, they're expanding their property, and if they're going further away from the high water mark, or they're going further away from the fish habitat zone, or they're expanding in the direction opposite of where an EP zone is, for instance. Those may be situations where you wouldn't need an environmental study because you're not moving closer to the sensitive area. So I just was cautioned. I don't think shall is the appropriate word in many instances, but I don't think it's here. I think really what the township might want to consider is just strengthening up their own internal guidelines and protocols of what is required in what situation.
Okay, Armin.
That's it. The planning, shall is a very strong planning word, and it would put everybody on the hook for every study, which I don't believe is appropriate at all.
And I would agree with that as well.
Armin.
As would I. I agree with Beth on that point. Just to reiterate what I said earlier in terms of Peter's comments with respect to, that planning work is done by staff or whatever before septics are approved and so on. I'm not aware, like any planning application for which I've been of some assistance, or in some cases I've arranged it for an applicant, is required to do a geophysical analysis, an environmental study. You have to do an EIS. There are many items that can be very expensive under the existing protocols. And so nobody is getting any septic, or nobody's getting any lots approved for severance without those, I can guarantee you. There's environmental companies like Mikowski Nielsen and Pinestone Environmental and people like that who've done a lot of work in this community. And they go and they spend a lot of time and a lot of money going out and preparing very comprehensive reports, and they will pick the appropriate septic envelopes and building envelopes and dock envelopes and all of the things that you've expressed concerns about. So that's already being done. And so I think where's our planning staff on this? Like, I mean, am I correct in the rumor that I heard that Dr. Ascola has retired or has left his position? And if so, what are we doing about getting some support?
Julie, please.
Thank you, Chair Hazelton. I apologize in advance for my voice. That's a little bit squeaky this morning. Yes, you are correct. We failed to send out a communication to the planning committee with regards to Dr. Espila's departure from the Township of Georgian Bay. The interim plan is to use the services of JLR in a more profound manner. We've got one of their senior planners who has stepped in as a interim manager to deal with the workload. And we're still having discussions on how that will look on budgets, but we will bring back a report to council shortly.
Is, is there a reason through you, Mr. Chair, to the acting CAO, why JL Richards isn't on this call today? Because they might have, certainly if they're taking more responsibility in that role, I think it would have been helpful for them to be part of this call to hear some of the things that we're talking about.
Here, here.
You may not have an answer. I was really surprised that JL Richards was not going to be on the call.
Yeah, so we're having resource issues all across the board. They have other clients beyond the Township of Georgian Bay. So we're still ironing out how the service agreement changes with a missing director of planning. So that's the reason they're not on this call today. We're still ironing out what it looks like and what kind of hours they are going to put into the Township of Georgian Bay.
Thank you, Julie. And
So
just
this
for,
would have been on Jason's, sorry.
go ahead, Beth.
I just would say, I thought Jason has been on all of our planning committee meetings so far. I just would have thought this was on his calendar, but perhaps not.
Yeah,
And
there's been a
Mr. Chair.
lot more hours put on by GLR, and we had to make some adjustments. And I thought, you know, with the liberties of this committee to bring something forward to council, I thought it was appropriate that that we, you know, through discussions with the chair, that we proceed with this meeting without the staff resources. Unfortunately, staff, including our consultants at this time.
Thank you. So we all did get a note from Karen earlier indicating that we wouldn't have JL Richards or planning staff on this call. The mayor and I had a chat. The idea was, do we skip this month altogether and not have any opportunity to discuss this key topic which we had wanted to talk about, or do we talk about it in a slightly less formal manner? And it was my recommendation to the mayor that we continue with the group as we have, and try to find some way of providing some value and guidance to council. So that's where we are at the moment. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, just following up on that, I note that at our last meeting, Dr. Aspala said that township planning staff were very much aware of Bill 109 and were addressing how to respond to that. So we're having this discussion in a bit of a vacuum, because maybe there are things that have been done or have been thought about being done by planning staff that we're unaware of.
That is certainly something that could have happened, may have happened. I think Dr. Aspala's last day was today. I think, was that right, Sydney? Today is, or do you know?
He departed earlier this week, but
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So if I could be liberal with the comments, if the planning staff were investigating it, I doubt it would be the junior planning staff. And if Dr. Aspala has left, it's probably any investigation research is leaving with his departure. And so we're potentially in a bit of a vacuum on that, other than what JL Richards have been doing, and presumably they have been following this topic as well. But I thought that with the kind of the brain trust we have here on this committee, it would be useful to try to find some way to offer recommendations on what we as a township could or should be doing. And I think so far what I'm getting from the comments made so far is that, and I like, Peter, the way you've described it, we seem to have the policy, but from an administrative standpoint, we may not have the rigors of deploying the items in the so-called checklist. And I don't even know if we have a checklist like the examples that Beth has provided. But it sounds to me like there is kind of a building consensus that the items in the OP that need to be prepared for a particular application need to be identified up front, and that they need to be communicated to any applicant up front, so that that the township can then monitor, kind of similar to the checklists that Beth has provided, monitor where the application is and be able to come up with a fairly crisp definition of when the application is complete, so that we can then allow the clock to start ticking at that point in time. So I would assume that from what I've heard, that that's a little bit different than perhaps what we have been doing. I mean, I would actually like to kind of toss things over to Beth one more time, put her on the spot, you know, because Beth, you've mentioned this topic of functional servicing, and you know, certainly in a urban environment where you've got you know, the characteristics of, you know, municipal water and sewer and so on, those all tend to be so perhaps more well understood. And when you have roads, you know that you can get all the appropriate servicing to the property, such as, you know, fire, EMS, you know, septic pump out, and etc. But perhaps that is a topic that we should be providing council with some more input on, because this whole concept of functional servicing, even to the point of stormwater, and I have to confess, I'm just going to give you a little example of something that you know, caught my attention on stormwater. I kind of thought, well, what has stormwater got to do with cottage country? And you know, we have an example in North Bay, actually a property fairly close to Maracootsiers, where the septic system was built on a forward sloping rock face, and all these appropriate materials were brought in. I guess the setbacks may have been you know, to building code, maybe not to the current standards, but several years ago we had a very, very wet year, and essentially what happened was all of the rains flushed out the contents of the tile bed into the waters in front of the cottage, and we had a very, very significant blue-green algae bloom on that property. And I think that from the conclusions I've come to and others have come to is, had that property been assessed in the way that we, I think, are talking about upfront, and you know, from a full servicing perspective, it may not have been, the septic system may not have been built in that location. There may have been other considerations brought into the mix, and this flushing out of the septic system probably wouldn't have taken place. So Beth, can I put you on the spot and get you to talk a little bit about functional servicing?
Well, and if I can bring out a couple examples in the process, I'd like to. And your comment about stormwater, and I hadn't considered that either. I was still considering storm sewer in terms of stormwater management pond and capacity, but absolutely. There was one situation in the Cognishine community where a septic system was put forward of the cottage, in front of the cottage, on a gently sloping bald rock that goes down to the lake. And those that are in our community will know which property I'm talking about. But that the ability of that did exist on that particular property to pump it back to a more suitable location that would have drained away from the lake. And it became a cost consideration to that particular owner, in which case he decided to put it in the front. Then he had to build another wall and a retaining wall to try and retain the effluent. I think, to my earlier comment about environment first, and no, Armin, I didn't mean that we needed to have two septic locations. It was more about the philosophy of environment first and determining the functionality and the serviceability of a site before you determine if it's appropriate for development at all. But those are the sorts of considerations that you need to take into account. Without a site visit, to know that or a contour plan, for instance, or an understanding of the lay of the land, how the drainage patterns were, you don't know where the suitable location is. And I have found, Armin, and I know maybe you're a bit more diligent than others because that's your business. When you are representing an applicant for a septic and a cottage construction, you're looking at the whole picture. But not everybody does that. And there have been situations where lands have been severed and all they've done is put an envelope on a map, no contour drawing. They may have had a survey of where the high water mark is, may not have shown where the flood elevation was either, which is really critically important. But all of those things really need to be considered up front because, as I said earlier at the start, once you've established the principle of development, you can't go back to that owner and say, sorry, you can't fit a septic, therefore our approvals are null and void. And to a point earlier made by Armin about, or I think of somebody about it be a penalty to the municipality if you don't handle it up front, some of these studies, it could actually be a penalty to the applicant because if you've given approval and they can't fit the septic system on the property, they may have to come back for another minor variance down the road to seek a lesser setback to the front yard, rear yard, whatever the case may be. So those are all considerations, but I want to talk about, and Chair, you mentioned this about the accessibility and others have as well. And it's too bad planning staff aren't on this call because oftentimes it helps to go back and look at past situations, past applications of where things have gone amiss or awry. And there was one particular application where a hold was lifted and the applicant applied in November. The public meeting notice went out right away, and the council lifted the hold on that particular property. This is an undersized vacant lot of record in January the subsequent year. So within 2 months, that was rammed through, approval done. There was no assessment whatsoever of whether or not a septic could be accommodated on that particular property. There was no site visit in the dead of winter. And as it turns out, the channel access to that property in a low water level year was a foot deep. And this is why, and I alluded to in my note, is this whole discussion will gravitate into, I think, other things like what is a navigable waterway? How do you define a waterfront lot? And they're all things that we're going to be talking about in the waterfront policy review, but they're critical. You can't develop a waterfront lot if you can't get access to it. And the only area in the official plan right now that I think has it partly correct and not totally correct, and that is the Cognizine waterfront policy says in order to create a new lot, you have to have sufficient depth in the lowest water level conditions to be able to not only get a barge in to construct, but you also need to be able to maintain a system, because that's the only way we can maintain a septic system down the road is to bring in a barge big enough to take a pump out. So those are aspects that are critical to consider on the servicing side, as well as you've got to make sure a property is accessible before you lift the hold, and without, docks that are 200 feet long to get water, for instance. You've got to make sure that they have an ability to get a water supply. I raised that in my note as well. But there's also emergency response. So if you don't have sufficient water access to get to a property, and it's not just in front of the property, this was actually on the way to the property, you can't have emergency response either. And so if there was a medical emergency, or if there was a fire, or any other time that you might need the fireboat to come in, that's why access is just so important. So I've been really looking forward to having the discussion with the planning staff and with J.L. Richards, and maybe recounting some of this past applications and errors and things that were kind of short-sighted to say, let's develop a protocol for, and this is part of the complete application discussion today, about what you need to assess before you move forward and deem an application complete and whether it's determined as suitable for development. Mr. Chair, I don't know whether that answers what you were looking for. Maybe there were a few things there.
It's helpful. I think something that would be helpful in this meeting is to find a way to identify things that perhaps from your checklist, perhaps from key bullets or key sections from the OP, where these are items that really are critical in the definition of a complete application, and that we would want to, as you were just kind of referring to, engage the planning staff in ensuring that that these are kind of well articulated in the administrative process, so that we have consistency going forward, and that we have perhaps a clear definition of what a complete application is that could be shared with people when they come in looking to do things. And to your point, nobody wants to find out that there is a need for a species at risk analysis after they've already in their minds designed their future dream cottage, and then discover that maybe you can't get it. So I think that's one of the things that that I was hoping we could get to, is a recommendation of what those kinds of things could be. Armin.
Yeah, very interesting comments, and I agree with Beth on a lot of what she said, and I'm very familiar with the property, and I believe it was in the southwest tip of Burnt Island that she was referring with the septic, where there was breakout, and I was actually asked to be
Oh, yes,
involved in that, and I declined, because and believe it or not, in the backyard, the property was very large, and in the backyard, and agreed that it did have to have a pump, but there was about 4 feet of the nicest natural sand you ever saw. And yet the applicant wanted to put the septic in the front yard for whatever reason. And, we knew that it was going to fail before it went in. I believe that the reason I mentioned that was because I think we need to put a little bit more faith in the some of the staff and the professionals that we have on the payroll of the municipality, because many of them are very well informed. Dave Fedori just recently retired. He was a big resource lost, in my opinion. Kaylee Nicholson is now the new CBO. She's very well read on septic matters and things like that. And so I think if you're in doubt whatsoever, you should make it, talking about making things a requirement, or that you shall do something. I think that we should implement something where you have to have our local professionals that work for the municipality weigh in on these matters, and not simply leave it to consultants who may live many hours from here when they're preparing their reports. Certainly all of the information has to be weighed and considered, and the right outcome. But that example that Beth cited there could have been avoided and I remember having that discussion with the building department, and they said they agreed, that should have never been in the front, but yet it slipped through the cracks. So I think that's got to happen. And kind of circling back to what we talked about with Bill 109, and that is, we do have some challenges here, because this is largely the water access part of our community is largely, you can access at any time now with all the airboats and hovercraft and snowmobiles and things that are around, but you can't do a proper assessment on like a geophysical analysis or an environmental analysis of that property in the winter. And so for those reasons, I think those are the kinds of comments that I think we can provide, and the kind of information that we should include in a letter to the province if we're going to comment on Bill 109, and just say, we're not like the other municipalities in this way, and for that reason we can't comply, on some of these applications. And I think, if people know that up front, if they're contemplating severing a lot or doing some work on an existing property or redeveloping it, then they're gonna work within those timelines and get the work done ahead of time. So there is no excuse why it couldn't be approved if it's just a political matter to put it through planning council or whatever to get approved. Then that could be done in the off season, as long as all of the relevant environmental work was done previous to that meeting. So that's what all I've got.
Thank you for that. One thing I'll offer here on council, we do get circulated a lot of letters and messages that have been sent to the province by other townships. And certainly, as you can probably imagine, there's a lot of townships who are trying to push back on the province saying, you know, Bill 109 is inappropriate for our communities, blah, blah, blah. But as we have observed on many fronts, municipalities providing feedback to the province doesn't often get acted on. And so I think what we need to be embracing here is we have a new set of criteria that has been driven down by the province. We'll just simply call it Bill 109. And it does require us to I think, understand that, as we've already heard, there will be significant financial penalties to the township if we don't get a handle on a definition of what a complete application is for the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And if we don't get that defined, then we are going to see significant financial risk. And so, you know, the kinds of things that I'm hearing are, and I thought it was interesting, there was the planning justification report where I think the wording was, it needs to be, you know, explained as why it's a need and not just a want. And I'm not quite sure where that ultimately fits in with final decision making. I know on planning council, I hear other councillors frequently say, well, is this a need or is this a want? I mean, the example that Armin and Beth were just talking about, where the septic system was out front, you know, that apparently was a want and not a need. The ability to put a septic system on the back was certainly available. And so we don't hear those kinds of things necessarily coming to planning council. It's really more, you know, here's the application as it exists. And I think that it would be useful perhaps to have this need versus want kind of consideration. Beth, go ahead.
Well, I would say mostly that comes into play on a minor variance application, when somebody is seeking a lesser setback to high water mark, rear lot line, side lot line. But it also would apply in general zoning as well, because sometimes people are applying for rezoning for those lesser setbacks or increased GFA. So you could see it in a number of different Planning Act applications. And, you know, when somebody buys a property, they typically would understand its constraints. Is it essential that you go beyond that and apply for something different? Why? I think it really needs to be demonstrated why you can't work within the existing timelines. Sorry, within the existing guidelines and provisions. Sorry, I was just a call I needed to turn off. Got distracted.
Time sharing, are we? Yes.
No. I just was ringing, and it was thankfully not too loud. But yeah. So the need versus want. I've heard that expression. I think maybe more at committee of adjustment than council. But there's no reason why it doesn't apply to both. It really needs to be demonstrated, and that's the planning justification aspect of it, is why you cannot work within the prescribed setbacks and regulations within the bylaw.
So when we get at planning council, when we get applications, planning staff tend to get into the PPS, the district OP, the township OP, and the local zoning bylaws, and they tend to extract statements that supposedly support the application. But rarely do we ever see a need versus want kind of discussion. How would that be? You know, how would you describe that as an administrative requirement in an application?
Well, I'm not sure about that. But I think what the justification report would be saying why you can't comply. I can't physically do this for such and such a reason. So just give a reason for the application. And then that's what gets considered by the approving body, whether it's committee of adjustment or council.
Okay, so a planning application should include a planning justification report.
Well, for instance, I just had to apply to replace an existing dock, but I wrote a covering letter that was the justification for why didn't it need this? Why didn't it need that? Or, it's smaller, it's in the same location. I think sometimes maybe our forms are too basic, that there is a need for elaboration on some of the detail, and, maybe put some of that to the applicant as well.
Okay, so I want to channel some of our next round of chat here to fleshing out what a possible resolution might be that we could send off to council, and Sydney has kind of started us off where we're trying to establish clear procedures for deeming a planning application complete, and they should include, for example, and Beth, you and I were just chatting about the planning justification. So I think that's one thing that we should perhaps include. Peter, you wanted to offer?
Yeah, I've been, as we're talking, I've been thinking about sort of where we go with this. And I think I'm not sure whether we do this as a sort of a recommendation to staff coming from this committee, or whether you want to do it in a formal resolution. I leave that to you, to Mr. Chair. But I think what we want is we want planning staff to review their administrative procedures to include a consideration at the pre-consultation phase or upon receipt of an application of what items in official plan I.6.2.1 should be requested as part of a complete application.
Sydney, did you get that?
So just if I could add, it's Peter, it would be before the application is made. So that's typically part of the pre-consultation process. Some municipalities call it a pre-consultation application. So it's the timing aspect of maybe just the way you worded it there.
I think I worded it pre-consultation or upon receipt of the application, and the reason for that is my understanding is that the pre-consultation hasn't always been happening lately due to staff shortages. So it may be that some applications are received without ever having gone through a pre-consultation process.
Ian.
Yeah, I've been just listening, observing, and my sort of a number of takeaways. One is it's encouraging that we have the policies in place with respect to the OP and bylaws. It sounds as though it's really just, as I think Peter pointed out, I think Armin, Beth certainly is the administration of those policies of the OP. It's unfortunate that we have these planning committee meetings that we don't have someone from planning to sort of share with us what the processes are currently and how we can maybe assist them so that we can work through this Bill 109 so that the township is not in a position where they're having to refund money back to the applicants. But overall, it would be nice if I think the resolution would include some form of discussion on sharing what those actual administrative requirements are, so that we can either comment back at a later date, but overall, the policies are in place. It's really, I think, sort of structuring the administration in such a way that we can work with Bill 109. and it may be that we just delay some of the approvals until all of those sort of pieces of the pie are assembled. And it may create some sort of undue delays on the part of the applicant. But if the structure and administration is in place as to what is required to ensure that you've got a complete application, I think the expectations can be met by the township, so, and the township planning department.
Thank you. Beth, did you had your hand up?
Yeah, it was just, I wanted, we were talking about too earlier, if everything is in the official plan that we would need. And I would suggest that there's some areas that we do need some modifications to the OP, and maybe that comes out through the waterfront policy review. And I guess I didn't finish my trend of thought as it related to the access or the navigability definition, which is in the Cognition waterfront policy section, which doesn't apply, unfortunately, across the entire township, is that there is a definition. It's not in the definition section, but it's right in the OP in terms of what defines a navigable waterway, ability to get access from a barge, that sort of thing. But in the Cognition provisions, it only pertained to new lot creation. It didn't pertain to, for instance, the lifting of the hold, which was pointed out at a particular OMB hearing. So there will be some modifications necessary to the official plan in order to make sure those things are applied township-wide on all waterfront access properties.
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask Sydney here. When Peter Folds was talking, did you capture those OP references?
No, sorry, I missed that. I got pre-consultation process. I don't know if it's easier for me to share my screen to have the resolution up, just to make sure I'm capturing everything that's being said.
Sure, let's do that.
Now, Member Hope's been quiet today. Jack, have you got any comments today?
Not a whole lot. You're all making a lot of sense today. So, and Armin and Beth are getting along beautifully. It's all good. I think from my main takeaway here is the policies seem to be in place with a little tweaking, but this is mainly an administrative discussion. You know, how policy is strategy, and administration and bylaws are tactics. How are we going to do what the plan, the OP, says we're to do? And I'm always a little concerned when we start changing or discussing changing the OP, when perhaps we should be looking at the bylaws, because the plan is fine, but how we need to apply, what we need to do to get to the plan is a little vague. So, you know, the OP is just a plan. And then the zoning bylaws tend to be how you implement the plan and what you can do to strategy versus tactics. And what I'm hearing is the policy looks pretty good, but the administration needs to be addressed. And you know, the obvious big thing in that is site visits. You know, the administration is not set up for site visits, and yet it's obvious in a lot of cases we do need site visits.
Can I just add on that? And well, you mentioned it, Jack, if I could, because this is supposed to be a casual conversation.
Absolutely.
Well, it's not in the Planning Act, and it's not on any of the pre-consultation lists that I did circulate it. I have had conversations with municipal staff, and it's a best practice. So it does happen, but it's not mandated or legislated, but it is a best practice. So maybe you can put it under that guise, if you will, which becomes then part of the guidelines and protocol for the pre-consultation process.
So Beth, I'm going to just help Sydney with one other bullet, if I may. Beth, you've talked about functional servicing requirements or functional servicing report. Is that something that we should be listing here?
Absolutely.
And Sydney, it's functional servicing is I think a bit of a planning term that incorporates a variety of things, and that may be a potential whole topic for another meeting. But in my understanding of functional servicing isn't just water, sewer, but it may also include access, ability, fire, EMS, all the rest of that kind of thing.
So yeah, I think the accessibility comes both under the servicing aspect, but when you think of in an urban situation, when you're creating a plan of subdivision or you're severing a new lot, a lot always has to have frontage on a public right of way. Otherwise, you've got no basis for an application because you have to be able to access. So I think accessibility and accessibility on a navigable waterway, whether it's immediately in front of the property or on the route to the property, those are absolutely essential things that need to be assessed, just as you couldn't create a lot if it didn't have frontage on a road. So that deserves a separate item, but I believe it needs consideration under the functional servicing report as it relates to getting a barge to a site to pump out and maintain a septic system forever in all water level conditions.
So should we expand the words functional servicing to include and accessibility?
Accessibility of water access only properties on a navigable waterway. But
Okay.
then as a committee, as you know, it's been on our priority list for discussion to come up with a better definition of waterfront lot and navigability or navigable waterway. We've yet to, even though we've been assigned it, we've yet to discuss it. So hopefully that can be a future topic on an upcoming agenda. So functional servicing, including accessibility to all water access only properties on a navigable waterway. Maybe that's a way to express it.
Armin, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, just a quick comment on the accessibility piece. We have properties in this municipality that were developed many years ago, in some cases 100 years ago. Go Home Bay, I mean, the Sand Run area, Present Island, at the south end of the township. We just were involved with the sale of a property there and have been a number of times in the past, but that's probably one of the most challenging places to get into because 90% of the island, if you walk out 1,000 feet from shore, there's not too many places where your shorts will get wet. That's how, and it's a beautiful sand island. There's a bunch of 100-foot lots that were created there many, many years ago. People are doing just fine. They're able to get in. They have a ring road that goes around the middle of the island that people who do have that are blessed with deeper water will allow barges to come in and equipment to access. And I'm not suggesting that we create a bunch of new lots in a scenario like that. But contractors are pretty resourceful. If you ask them to do something, even if it's in a challenging setting, they'll figure out a way to do it and without hurting the environment. And one of the things that we've been doing for many years is, and I've mentioned this in past meetings, is we use blasting mats, the big rubber blankets, they're almost 12 inches thick. If you lie those down in the water and use that as a temporary causeway to get to shore, not only does it make the job go easier, there's less wasted material with things bumping and falling out of the bucket and causing other siltation and so on, but it protects the lake bottom to the extent that you don't have the rutting from the tires with wet soil. So there's opportunities to do things like that. And probably that, if there are properties that are challenging like that needs to be on the checklist too, is like, we'll give you approval to do this, but you've got to use these mitigating measures to make sure that you're not destroying the shoreline as the part of the construction. So there are ways to do that, and I'd be happy to sit with anybody that wants to listen. But one of the big things that the main point that I wanted to make is, I think that Bill 109, and I'm getting a bit philosophical here, but I mean, there's a need to create more housing for our own people and for immigrants. And I think that they're trying to facilitate and fast track some of these, and we have to be careful when we fast track anything and make sure we don't miss a step. But one of the things that is really difficult, and it kind of upset me a little bit in the last meeting, I mentioned about some of the dock provisions and so on, that they're very confusing. Beth and I agreed on the fact that the Schedule D at the back of the zoning bylaw, which has illustrations of various dock components and so on, that should form part of the bylaw. It's not just a suggestion. And one of the reasons that we need to do that type of thing, and that's only one example of many, one of the things that I believe is that because we've had such a large turnover in planning staff and building staff over the last 20 years almost, it's just astounding. I would like, if it's not inappropriate, I would like to find out how many planners and how many planning assistants have passed through the doors of this municipality just even in the last 10 years. And it's breakneck speed. And whenever you lose somebody, you lose a resource in the municipality that may have had past dealings with another file that would assist with a future file. And knowledge is power. And if you keep having new staff that need to interpret a very, very difficult bylaw and zoning and official plan, as we have in our municipality, then that's what's stalling a lot of these applications. And I know that there were comments when I mentioned about trying to facilitate some of the dock provisions that, well, it's supposed to be hard. We're trying to protect our shoreline, and the best way, we're probably better to spend some of our efforts on the environmental side of things as opposed to just stopping somebody from building on a property or making it so hard for them that they get frustrated and they sell the property and move away, which has happened in a number of cases. And I just don't think there's any need for that. Let's figure out a way to make our administration a little bit more efficient, so that it is easier. Archipelago, I've mentioned this in the past meetings, many years ago, that Archipelago, when they did their comprehensive zoning bylaw, they have a Reader's Digest version. They have a very thin document that is relevant to docks and building placement and all those kinds of things. And the average person is able to read that in very short order and comprehend what's allowed or what's not allowed. We don't have anything like that. We've got a 300-page document in the zoning bylaw. And even though I've read it multiple times and I was involved in all of the planning sessions as a volunteer when we created these bylaws, there's no simple way to interpret it, because you can't get the answer on a single page. You've got to go to multiple sections and examine every provision to know whether one cancels the other out. And I think that's very inefficient. I think we need to figure out ways to make our bylaw more user-friendly so the average person can interpret what's really going on there, so that they can spend their money in the right place and get the thing done properly with the maximum environmental approval. And the other thing, I know I've been long-winded, and thank you for your patience, but one of the things that really upset me about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a forum that was held in the council chambers, and at the behest of many of us in the community, including planners and so on, to really study the different types of proprietary sewage systems that are out there. And at the end of it, one of the leading experts, I believe he was from Guelph, there's an institute down there, Alan, you probably know it off by heart, but he said, well, basically at the end of the day, there's no proof that a tertiary system is any more efficient than an anaerobic system, which to me, like, my heart just sank when I heard that, because that was exactly the opposite of what we wanted to hear. And it's not true. There are lots of tertiary systems that are, at a simple diagnosis, that CBOD is reduced by about 20 times as efficiently in a tertiary system as it is in a regular anaerobic septic bed. And so is it perfect? No, because the nutrient reduction requires much more attention. But if you are in situations where you see that there's a lot of rock or there's a lot of clay or that it's not an ideal situation, this municipality would be well served in their bylaw to say, in those situations, we should be using tertiary treatment because the effluent quality is that much cleaner when it exits the primary stage of the secondary stage of the septic tank. So those are all things that I think would make a lot of sense. And if you're worried about water quality and blue-green algae blooms and things like that, those are all things that would make a huge difference in the outcome of the health of our shoreline. Done.
Oh,
Sorry,
you're muted.
Can't hear you, Alan.
Sorry, my phone was ringing earlier and I wanted to kill it and make no noise, and so I was on mute. Paul, you were next.
Yeah, I tend to agree with the direction the discussion's going, but the concern I have is on when things should be done in a proper phasing, especially when a proponent is going to be putting out large amounts of cash in order to get all the various studies done for the complete application. And so I'm not just too sure, do we do a site visit before we do pre-consultations? If you can't access the properties, and if you can't do a site visit. So I think when this is all laid out, I think you need to look at what phases have to be done in what order, so a proponent is not led down a false path and spends tens of thousands of dollars doing studies, and you find out you can't even access the property, or there's no place for a septic system or whatever. So there needs to be a phased in approach here, and I like to see that in some kind of a format going forward.
Thank you, Beth.
And I don't disagree with member Wieko on that either, but I was just going to suggest maybe another way to order this resolution, because the pre-consultation process really should be part of the be it resolved. So I was going to just suggest direct staff to establish clear procedures through a pre-consultation process. So put it in the body of that to determine the necessary supporting studies required to deem an application complete. And so take the pre-consultation process out of the bullet, put it in the body as you've done. Yeah, that's it. And so remove pre-consultation as a bullet. And I would, functional servicing, maybe you want to elaborate that that's sanitary water source and stormwater management, but recognizing we're not talking about a pond here, we're talking about drainage direction and appropriateness of the location. And I think accessibility deserves a separate bullet, even though it would be discussed under the functioning servicing. But I think the key thing that's missing here is it's an ability to gain access for water access only properties on a navigable waterway without the need for blasting or dredging. And I refer again to the Cognizine policies where we have defined that it is fine if you have an existing developed property, and Armin, you alluded to some of those situations, that if somebody is challenged to get to an existing developed property because of water level fluctuations, that our own OP today allows blasting and dredging to do that. But I don't think we should be looking at blasting and dredging to create developable properties. So I think that's a key aspect of this particular resolution that we should include. So I'm just added to the fourth bullet, without the need to blast or dredge. No, add it to the fourth bullet. Sydney, is what I was thinking.
Or perhaps a sub-bullet to the accessibility bullet.
Whatever, I just thought it was an important piece to add to the resolution.
I think that's already in the zoning bylaw, isn't it?
No, it's Armin, it's only in the Cognizine policy, and it only relates to new lot creation. It doesn't even relate to the hold provisions. We went through that through a board hearing where it was argued that it was not a township-wide understanding of the definition of navigable waterway.
I would support that in the case of a new lot creation. I would
Yeah.
definitely support that.
New
I
lot
don't think-
creation and lifting of a hold as well, because, you know, many of those undersized vacant lots of record were, you know, carved up before there was any consideration of, there was no land use legislation, there were no environmental policies, nobody assessed if they could actually get access. It was just surveyors carving up the land.
I think we're getting into,
Way undersized. Sorry?
it's through you, Mr. Chair, we're getting onto a slippery slope when you do that, because some of these properties were created long enough ago that, you know, people have held these properties, paid taxes on them in good faith. They were zoned residential and now they're not. They've got a hold on them. I really feel that unless the municipality is prepared to compensate those people for the lost life savings in some cases, then how do you do that? Or maybe there's an opportunity for the Georgian Bay Land Trust to get involved in situations like that, where at least the person gets some kind of tax break. Because if you're going to strip you know, there are legal precedents for that, especially out west from what I've given to understand, where developers have sued the municipality and they've won because they've basically expropriated property without compensation. And so I think, you know, even during the whole the zoning bylaw review that we went through on a number of occasions over the last few decades, I don't think sufficient attention was given by the municipality to contact these individuals to say, hey, you know, there's something about to happen that might strip your building rights from your property. And everybody said, no, all we got to do is post it in the newspaper and put it on the website. And some little old lady from North Bay who owns a property over here and maybe hasn't been paying attention loses her building rights. And that's happened on a few occasions. And I don't think it's right. So
Peter, you want to do it again?
Pardon me, Alan?
Oh, Peter Foltz had his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, so just, I want to address the draft resolution. I'm not sure that, I have a concern that we are, as a committee, maybe not ready to direct or recommend directing staff as to specific things that they should include in a complete application, because I think as the policy framework is set up now, it's within staff's discretion, and I'm not sure that we should be going beyond that. What I'd like to see in the resolution, where it talks about just before the bullet points, where it says to include the following, rather than specifically itemizing things, I would suggest we include and to include consideration of the items listed in OP, because they're already there. Paragraph I, point 6, point 2, point 1. And with respect to the bullet points, I think, well, the planning justification report is one of the items listed in the OP, so that's already covered. The site visit, I come back to my comments earlier in that I'm not sure that the township can require an applicant to include a township site visit as part of a complete application. So I think that's an administrative thing. And with respect to servicing, I think it's a listed item in the OP. And with respect to the navigable waterway, I would submit that that's a separate issue, and it's a policy issue that I think we need to address. I would suggest we put that in a separate resolution to council to consider a definition of navigable waterway as part of the waterfront policy review.
Which is already there. That is a topic for the waterfront policy review.
Yeah.
So your comment is these items that we have in the bullets are currently included, except for site plan, in the OP paragraph?
Except for site visit and the navigable waterway, which
Right.
I haven't, I'm not sure whether that's included in the OP or not, but if it is, then that's fine. If it isn't, then I don't think it's something that planning staff can request as part of a complete application if the policy framework isn't already there in the OP.
Okay, so
That is correct. It has to be, and I think that was in one of the pieces I circulated, is it needs to be part of the official plan. So if there's an amendment to the official plan that's needed for any additional work, then that would be part of the process.
so we need to, at some point in time, talk about an OP amendment to deal with and define navigable waterways, but that topic is already in the waterfront policy review.
And I don't have paragraph 1.6.2.1. Is that something, Sydney, that you could pull up just for us all to see? Because Peter, you've got it in front of you, and I think Al, you had looked at it.
Or
But
do you
when
want to-
I'm on my
Peter, do you-
computer, I can't do that too.
Peter, do you want to share your screen? Do you have it in front of you?
I have it in front of me. If someone can tell me how to share my screen.
That way we don't have to ask Sydney to go and find it.
Yeah.
And while Sydney, have you made Peter?
Yeah, so you should have screen share at the bottom of the screen beside the
Okay.
chat box.
Yeah, got it.
Because if a planning justification report has always been there, I'm not sure I've ever seen one. It's just been a completion of an application, which is pretty basic information.
Okay,
We're challenging Peter with technology.
you are challenging me because now it's got me in my security and
I'm glad it's you,
privacy.
not me.
So while you're struggling with that, let me just offer one comment here. We've already heard from Armin that we've gone through a lot of planners. And I agree, there's been a little bit of work done to figure out what our track record is. But I think, Peter, if I can focus on something that you offered here, you know, we have policy, and that's really what you're trying to highlight here, that the policy exists. We have administrative practices, and if I can just offer the experience that I've seen and that I'm being told about by residents, is that there is very little consistency in the administrative practices in enforcing the OP policy. And I think that what may be useful coming from the planning committee is tasking or recommending to staff that they find a way to do a better job of structuring the administrative practices to reflect consistency in enforcing or applying the OP policies. Peter, would you agree that that's kind of where you're trying to get to here?
I'm sorry, Alan. I'm caught up in this technological issue, and I didn't catch all of that.
Okay.
Am I sharing my screen now?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
You are.
Sorry, do you mind asking me that question again, Alan? Because
Okay. What I was trying to get to was this. We've had a lot of variability in the administrative practices as they go about deploying the policy that is articulated in the OP, not only with the complete application, but all kinds of other policies in the OP. And perhaps what is needed is a recommendation from the planning committee that staff find a way to articulate perhaps more structure in the administrative practices that will then reflect more consistency in deployment of the OP policies. Because right now, you get planner, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're going to get 5 different views of what policies they feel should be deployed on any particular application, and that is certainly an observation that we can speak to about many examples. So is there an easy way of kind of getting at that topic?
I think as a general statement, the desire for consistency is a good thing. I think I'm not sure you can fairly put that in a direction to staff coming from this committee, but that's just my personal view.
Ian, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, Alan, I think you've got a valid point. I think the consistency, will come from, I think the sort of checklist that I think staff, and they may have something now, but maybe they need something a little bit more sort of complete. I don't know what they use, but ultimately, I think through that checklist, and that checklist will vary depending on if it's new lot creation or expansion to existing dwelling or replacement of a septic system. But I think really it's up to staff to establish, I think, those checklists, those specific guidelines to determine when that application is complete and not have any sort of confusion. But it should be across the entire planning department, not just sort of individual planners and how they interpret the OP, how they interpret the bylaws. But I think there's a need, from what you were suggesting, there's a need for some consistency across the planning department. And to me, again, that comes from a very well-defined checklist of what is required of the applicant when he is coming forth with a planning application.
So first of all, Peter, thank you for sharing your screen. It looks like we do have a fairly comprehensive checklist. The challenge that I would suggest is what we were just talking about, which is how do we get this away from the individual personality who says, I need this or I need that, into a more structured and hopefully more consistent use of these items, so that and perhaps in some respects a definition of them, because I suspect if you were to ask 5 different planners, maybe not 5 different planners, what's a tree preservation plan? You probably get 5 different answers. So I think you're touching on a lot of the frustrations that we have here at the township, where there is significant inconsistency and a lot of frustration because of that inconsistency. But anyways, before we move back to Sydney's screen, are there any comments on this list that Peter has shared with us?
Peter, is this list in the OP? I've not seen this. It's really rather detailed.
Yeah, this is straight from the OP.
Huh.
So the planners who drafted the OP did a good job, I think, of including a comprehensive or almost comprehensive list of the types of reports that the planners can require.
Yeah.
And I think to get back to your point, Alan, I don't think it's desirable in a general way to dictate what reports the planner should ask for in all cases. I think it might be desirable because there's such a wide variety of applications, and clearly not all of these reports are appropriate in all cases, and in some cases maybe none of them are appropriate. But I think the most that council can do, if council is so inclined, is to say, with a certain type of application, let's say creation of a new lot, that these 2 or 3 reports shall be required in every case. But beyond that, I think it's best left up to staff's discretion. And then administratively, the planning department maybe will want to develop their own internal procedures and to try to get some consistency within the planning department.
Okay, thank you for that. Beth.
So I'm just going to add to an earlier comment I did say is if it is an existing developed property and you are planning an addition and you're going away from the high water mark or away from type 1 fish habitat shoreline or EP zone or whatever the case may be, but if you're moving away from the sensitive feature, it shouldn't be necessary to do an environmental impact assessment or species at risk assessment, I don't think, or a fish habitat assessment, because you're going away from the area of concern. That would just be my thought, but those are the sorts of guidelines that the staff can start to establish, is what applies in what situations. And that's exactly where, Peter was heading with this comment, I think.
Can I ask Sydney to reshare her screen? I think, first of all, thank you, Peter, for doing that. I think we can all go and look at the OP statements and get it back in front of us. But I'd like to try to wrap this up and see if we can finish off the resolution Sydney had in front of us. And it's coming back.
Mr. Chair, could I suggest when it's back on the screen, maybe some preamble to that, just be it resolved. So I think setting some context as to why we had this discussion today, and maybe it's something like in light of Bill 109 and the need to mitigate financial implications to the township with respect to refunds of application fees anticipated by Bill 109, that we see. So then that just provides the setup to the resolution that you've got.
So a whereas clause, Sydney, in front of the be it resolved.
I just put it in light of Bill 109 and the need to mitigate financial implications to the township with respect to a refund of application fees anticipated by the Bill 109.
Beth, hold on.
Do you want me
No,
just to
I just wanted to read it. Does that make sense to everyone to add?
Yes.
that makes
I think
sense.
it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Want me just to copy the whereas clause from the last resolution that was passed at the committee meeting, which was in relation to,
Maybe it's there.
okay,
see
just
what it
let me
looks
just give 1 second. Let me just stop sharing my screen. I'll be 2 seconds.
And then while Sydney's finding that, I think what Peter Foles was suggesting is that we pull the bullets out of that and just focus on leveraging the list of items in the OP. And while Sydney's continuing to look at that, Jack, do you still have your hand up?
The third bullet point there, there's a typo and it says functioning rather than functional.
Yeah.
But
no,
if
I
we're
think-
taking the bullet points out, then it doesn't matter.
Okay, yeah, I think we're
Does-
going to.
The site visit isn't on that comprehensive list that Peter just shared on his screen. So maybe that is something that is added for consideration.
So this was a direct copy and paste from the last resolution.
Okay, it's kind of inherent in that for anybody that knows what Bill 109 is, for those that don't, they wouldn't understand why it is we're doing this.
Yeah. So just for fun, can we leave the site visit bullet there for 1 second and just see what it looks like when we're done? So we are going to, through pre-consultation process, consider the items in the OP. Could we put an and find a way or consider finding a way to include a site visit as part of the pre-consultation process?
And when that would be appropriate, because a site visit isn't necessary on an urban minor variance application, for instance. So I think you just have to say on applicable circumstances.
So Sydney, and that after the I.6.2.1, and that it would be, and that a site visit be considered as a requirement. And Beth, you would put some other words in there?
I would just say in certain situations, but that would be something to be discussed.
Yeah, so as long as it's in there as considered as a requirement.
Yes,
Are appropriate.
we're appropriate like that.
Yeah, where appropriate. Good. Thank you, Sydney. And that this procedure be presented to back to the planning committee. Is that what we'd like to find out what staff's interpretation is of all this and then take another look at it?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we have a resolution. Can I have a mover to that? That would be Beth, a seconder, Ian Davis, and any more discussion? I'll call vote. All in favor? And that is approved. Jack, you wanted to make comment?
Actually, I was just wondering if we didn't already have the site visit thing covered in the preamble that we had inserted in that resolution.
So the preamble were whereas clauses as opposed to be it resolved. Just it's the structure thing. Cindy, could you just throw that up one more time?
Mhm.
What's in the third whereas? Completed May.
So it, yeah, may include blah, blah, blah. So we're saying in the whereas clauses, which in the so-called structure of resolutions and motions is equivalent to the background information. And then the be it resolved, anything below that is what the actual resolution and ask is of council. So it really should be reflected there. Anyways. So we are right at 12 o'clock and I'm trying to be respectful of time here. So I would like to ask for the final resolution of our meeting, which is a motion to adjourn. And who would like to move a motion? Armin, who wants to second that? I see Beth trying to put her hand up. And all in favor? Already. Okay, thank you all for this. And I look forward to chatting with you again next month.